Autism diagnosis is based on science, right? We trust the experts because they know what they're talking about, right? But what if I told you that the entire diagnostic process is based upon an assumption that's just as ridiculous as believing in invisible pink unicorns? Now imagine you and I are sitting in the middle of a lounge room, and in between us is a coffee table. And I say to you, in the middle of that coffee table is an invisible pink unicorn balancing on the tip of its horn. Now you can't hear, see, smell, touch or taste that unicorn, and you can't detect it with any kind of equipment. But trust me, it's there. Now you give me a bit of a funny look, scrunch up your face thinking about it, and then you say, well, if you can't hear, see, smell, touch or taste it, and you can't detect it with any kind of equipment, how can you possibly know it's there? And I just smile confidently and say, well, I have this special book, and when I tick off enough boxes in it, it tells me that there is an invisible pink unicorn balancing on the tip of its horn in the middle of that coffee table. This book makes me an expert on identifying them. Now you really give me a funny look. You think about it a bit more, and then you say, well, if there's no way of perceiving this unicorn in any way, shape or form, how did the people who wrote that book know how to identify them? Why, that's simple, I say. Through studying invisible pink unicorns balancing on the tip of their horn in the middle of coffee tables. Now, it sounds absolutely ridiculous, right? But that's exactly how autism is diagnosed. And you will be absolutely stunned to find out what autism diagnosis is actually based upon, or more to the point, what it's not based upon. Autism is described as a neurological disorder, but let's examine this statement more closely. Disorder is another invisible pink unicorn. It's an arbitrary label applied based upon the observation of behaviour and not upon biological fact. There is no definitive test for autism. There's no blood test, no brain scan, and no consistent genetic markers. Autism is diagnosed purely upon behavioural checklists. But these checklists are created by studying people who are already labelled as autistic. This is circular reasoning. We can identify autism in people because we have these behavioural checklists that we created by studying autistic people. Let's just take a moment to think about this. If you need the diagnostic criteria to work out whether somebody is autistic or not, how did they identify the people they needed to study to create the diagnostic criteria in the first place? It's absolute lunacy. In reality, they absolutely do not know what autism is or what causes it. Even though they can spend hours quoting you study after study, all they really have is a bunch of unproven theories and their expert opinions. When you strip those away from autism's identity, all you are left with is a bunch of identified behaviours and traits. But the problem with those is that they are not exclusive to autism. Every single one of them can be found in the general population to some degree or another. So when you take those away from autism's identity, what are you left with? You're left with just a ghost. You're left with a disorder that has no physically tangible foundation whatsoever. You cannot find autism in any part of the body with any kind of testing equipment. The idea of autism as a possessible entity is just that, an idea. It's a created concept held together by belief rather than physical facts. Now, if the behaviours and traits identified as autistic exist in the general population to some degree or another, then the autism spectrum is a created illusion. It's just the extreme end of a spectrum of behaviours and traits that spans the entire population. This therefore means that the dividing line between autistic and neurotypical is also a created illusion. It does not exist in nature. It has no physical tangibility whatsoever. You cannot find it with any kind of testing equipment. It's another invisible pink unicorn. The fake dividing line and the fake autism spectrum create the illusion that a person who just meets the diagnostic criteria for autism has something inside of them that the person who doesn't quite meet the criteria does not. The reality is the person who just meets the diagnostic criteria only has a slightly more intense version of what the person who doesn't meet the criteria has. When you add all this to the high misdiagnosis rates for autism, all an autism diagnosis means is that you may or may not have something that's never been proven to exist as a possessible entity. But autism diagnosis doesn't just rely on the idea of the existence of a disorder. It also depends on an even bigger invisible pink unicorn, the myth of normal. The mental health system assumes that there is a default correct way for humans to think, feel, and behave. But normal isn't an objective reality. It's culturally dependent. It changes across societies and time periods. Normal is statistical, not biological. It's based upon what the majority does, not an inherent right way to be. Normal is socially constructed. It's a shifting standard that reflects societal preferences, not scientific truths. So if normal isn't a fixed reality, then neither is the concept of a disorder. The existence of one relies upon the existence of the other. Autism isn't an inherent problem. It's just a divergence from a socially constructed standard. The only reason autism is seen as a disorder is because society has decided that certain traits are undesirable. If society had different values, we wouldn't call these different behaviors symptoms. We'd simply call them differences. Without the myth of normal, the structure of autism as a disorder completely collapses. But here's where things get really interesting. Autism diagnosis rates have skyrocketed over the last 45 years, from 1 in 10,000 to now 1 in 32. If this increase continues at this rate, we will very soon reach the point where those diagnosed as autistic outnumber neurotypicals. This leads us to a thought-provoking question. Who will be the normal ones then? Will neurotypicals all of a sudden start being diagnosed with social hyperconformity disorder? Will small talk, eye contact, or emotional spontaneity be seen as deviant behaviors? Or will those who rely on social intuition rather than logical analysis start to be labeled as having a condition? If the definition of normal is based upon the majority and autism diagnosis rates keep rising, what happens when the tables turn? What happens when being neurotypical is the minority? This exposes the arbitrary nature of normal. If normal is just a numbers game, then it was never real to begin with. Autism isn't a disorder. It's just a different way of being, a different operating system, not a malfunctioning one. Autism only exists as a disorder because of the myth of normal. The whole diagnostic process is based upon circular reasoning and self-referential definitions. Without an objective definition of normal, the whole concept of a disorder is meaningless. As more people are diagnosed, the definition of normal will have to be changed, proving that it was never real to begin with. The mental health system isn't diagnosing a neurological condition, it's diagnosing nonconformity. Everything that's been presented in this video shows that autism diagnosis is just modern-day witch doctory. It's a belief system masquerading as a science, justifying itself through self-referential logic and enforcing an illusion of normal that was never real to begin with. Instead of pointing at a person with unusual behavior and labeling them as a witch like they did in centuries past, they now point at a person with unusual behavior and label them as autistic. Just like the famous witch trials relied on vague and subjective signs of witchcraft, modern-day autism diagnosis relies on vague and subjective behavioral checklists. Autism as a tangible entity has never been established. There are no consistent biomarkers that can be found in all diagnosed cases of autism. The idea of autism as a disorder, as something broken or defective, has never been conclusively proven. And its existence as a disorder relies on the existence of normal, which is nothing but an absolute myth. A disorder can only exist if normal exists. The idea of exclusive autistic behaviors and traits is also a complete fabrication. It's used to create the illusion of the dividing line between neurotypical and autistic, which is then used to create the illusion of the autism spectrum. All this then goes together to create the illusion that someone diagnosed as autistic has something inside of them that the general population does not. And then they expect us to believe that they can somehow identify this completely intangible entity just through the subjective observation and interpretation of behavior, assessed against the criteria that was subjectively created through the observation and interpretation of behavior of people that they somehow identified as being autistic, even though they hadn't yet created the criteria, which is the only thing they can use to identify whether somebody is autistic or not. It's absolute madness. The whole diagnostic process and the diagnostic criteria itself are based upon no physical evidence whatsoever that autism exists as a tangible, possessible entity. I mean, seriously, they might as well be just, you know, hang on, all right, man, wait a minute, just check out, yep, you're definitely autistic. I mean, they might as well drag out the old knuckle bones and give them a throw and see what they say, or sacrifice a chicken so they can read its entrails. I mean, it's just one big shell game. It's absolutely ludicrous what they're doing and getting away with. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think autism is a disorder, or is it just a different way of being? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd really love to hear your take on this. And while you're at it, tell me, can you see that pink unicorn now? For those of you who want to learn more about how autism diagnosis is modern day witch doctory, then I'll put a link in the description below to one of my blog posts, My Reasons Not to Get an Autism Diagnosis. And I've also put a link down there to my free PDF, Breaking Free, How Trauma Shapes Autism Challenges and the Path to Healing. With the right tools and support, navigating daily life can become an opportunity for success rather than a source of stress and defeat. And for those of you who want to learn how trauma is the root cause of practically all of the challenges you face on the autism spectrum, then check out this video up here.